All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Jenny Wolfe's 2010 Lewis Carroll biography titled The Mystery of Lewis Carroll. Probably one of the most interesting books I read all summer, last summer, certainly the one I enjoyed most. It's almost hard to know where to begin with this one because there's so many things I appreciated about it. I guess, and I admit I'm not entirely sure what basis I had for this, but I had always kind of thought of Lewis Carroll as very whimsical and childlike, kind of aloof, kind of in his own little world. I guess almost kind of like a Harold Skimpole type of character, and I'm kind of learning how inaccurate that is. He had a whimsical side. He loved riddles, he loved puzzles, mathematical, logical puzzles, and games of that sort. And he loved being around children, and in some sense, he was, you could say, very childlike. But altogether, he definitely had more of John Jarndyce to him than he had of Harold Skimpole. These are Bleak House references for those not super familiar with Dickens. He was a guy that had a lot of people to look after and shouldered a lot of responsibility and clearly felt a decisive moral responsibility to help others in need in spite of his relatively limited means. He was not wealthy at any point in his life, but he certainly lived within his means and he certainly did a lot of good and was very charitable with what he had. So, yeah, he had a pleasant, playful side that was somewhat in keeping with the stereotype a lot of people have of him, but I think what reading Woolf's biography gives you is a sense that this was also a very morally serious, very morally earnest person who took his responsibilities in life very, very seriously. And this is where maybe we should get to the elephant in the room. There's always been an assumption pretty widely held that Lewis Carroll was at the very least he had strong pedophilic urges is what a lot of people seem to assume. I had heard people make this insinuation about him before enough times that I'll be honest, I'd assumed it was probably true. I think I first came across it in writing in Elizabeth Abbott's book, The History of Celibacy. As the title suggests, Abbott assumes Carroll probably died a virgin, but also seems to operate under the assumption that he was attracted to prepubescent girls. And to be fair to Abbott, this passage was like a third of a very short chapter of a book, so it's not as though this was something she was going out of her way to disseminate or anything, but the lack of hesitation on Abbott's part in including him in that book shows how well established the assumption was that Lewis Carroll at least had these urges. Woolf's book is very critical of that theory. And part of what she does that I think is kind of helpful is looking at okay, well, what was the actual source of this idea? Where did it come from? And the thing is, it really all originated not during his lifetime or from anybody who knew him during his lifetime, but with critics in the 1930s during that sort of wave of anti Victorianism. In a time when there was a sort of craze for just, whoever was loved and respected in the Victorian era. Whatever means you have of tearing them down, you gotta do it. And of course, this was the period when, of course, Dickens biographers started really trying to draw out the really ugly aspects of Dickens's personal life, which, in the case of Dickens, were certainly there. In case of Dickens, going on a tangent here, but I mean, there's a reason Anthony Trollope said, Dickens is not a person who should be admired shortly after he died. But yeah, to take this back to Carroll, what you really had was in the 1930s Freudian critics coming up with Freudian readings of Alice in Wonderland. And Freudians, being Freudians, of course, assumed that they assumed that the book was sexual. They assumed that what they saw in it must be symbols of repressed desires. And this would have been when, very, very few people were around who could have known him during his lifetime. But the few people who were not fans of this theory as it was emerging. The theory that Lewis Carroll must have been pedophilic. But you can see how easy it would be once this idea was floated for people to start twisting evidence to try and fit the theory. I think that sort of motivated reasoning, coupled with a relatively poor understanding of the time period, have sort of allowed that assumption to grow a little bit. And not to give too much away, because I hope people will read the book, but to give just one example, like, it was considered pretty scandalous for an unmarried man and a woman to be spending time alone. And Lewis Carroll had a female friend in her 20s. He was a little older, 30s, I think, who he spent a lot of time with. And people who knew him thought he was being very reckless of his reputation in being an unmarried man and spending that kind of time alone with a woman. And when cautioned about what he was doing, he would defend their friendship by kind of exaggerating the age difference between them. So saying things like, she's just a girl, what are you talking about? I'm old enough to be her father. Leave us alone. That kind of line of defense. And of course, he didn't know that people were going to be reading this in a time period when it was kind of the opposite of that, where that made it more suspicious, not less suspicious. So it's just little things like that, which, if read anachronistically, would seem to fit this narrative, but in the full context, they really don't. The other thing about this bio that I really enjoyed, that I thought was really cool, was she gets into Lewis Carroll's interest in consciousness, like dream states, and other, odd or intermediate states of consciousness. Like, I come at this as someone who really, really loved Sylvie and Bruno. Found it far more fascinating and entertaining read than I found either of the Alice books to be. And part of what I love about Sylvie and Bruno is that rather than what you have in Alice in Wonderland, where you have a real world, and from the real world you enter this fantasy world, Sylvie and Bruno is a lot more complicated. So the main character, and it's an adult male in this book, will be in the human world, but then there's a real world where fairies are there and he's talking to them, but only he can see and hear them, we think. And then there are moments where he slips into the fairy world and he's interacting with them. Other times he's perceiving their world but can't interact with them. And it's not always clear how this happens, what triggers a switch from one state to another. It's not anything as simple as him just like dreaming and then waking up, although in some cases that might be how it works. So just the variety of intermediate states between the human and the fairy world, and the confusion about how one moves between them, just adds another layer of strangeness to everything else that's strange in that book. Or two books, really. Sylvie and Bruno was published in the late 1880s, and then early 1890s he came out with another volume called Sylvie and Bruno Concluded. But to tie this back into Woolf's biography of Carroll, that's one of the things I really like about it. She touches on Carroll's sort of lifelong fascination with dreams and trances and alternate states of consciousness and the like. And of course, it wouldn't be a book about Lewis Carroll without getting into the really fun stuff. Here's my favorite passage from the entire book. Quote, "Perhaps the most extraordinary use of the number 42 is when the White Queen says, Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101, 5 months and a day. Edward Wakeling, editor of Carroll's diaries, and also a mathematician, has worked out that since the story was specifically set on the 4th of November, 1859, when Alice was exactly 7 and a half, Alice Little's birthday was May 4th, 1852, then the White Queen, taking account of leap years, was exactly 37,044 days old at the time when she spoke. The Red Queen, being a member of the same chess set, was, of course, the same age as the White Queen, giving the two queens a total combined age of 74,088 days, the sum of 42 times 42 times 42. So yeah, just lots of great stuff like that, and yeah, I highly, highly recommend that book. While we're here, there's one other biography I wanted to talk a little bit about. Um, Slightly older one. Daniel Farson's 1975, The Man Who Wrote Dracula. Which, of course, is a biography of Bram Stoker. It's on the shorter side, and it's not really a comprehensive bio. If you're looking for something that talks a lot about all the books that Stoker wrote and his composition process and the critical reception of all of them and all of that, this isn't quite that kind of biography. And I'll admit that's the kind of biography I normally get most excited about. But Farson's book is interesting in a different kind of way. It's just much lighter fare. As the title suggests, a lot of emphasis is on Dracula and Stoker's life and sort of where the two meet. What I always thought was one of the more unfortunate facts about his life was that he didn't live quite long enough to get rich off of Dracula, although his widow did. Now that's kind of a side note. So yeah, Farson gets into the history of vampires in mythology and lore and literature, but he also gets into vampire belief in the most literal sense, because a lot of different cultures have something like a vampire or believe in something like one. Different names, different explanations, but essentially so many variations on the same concept. It's a little bit like how, so many different ancient religions from all over the world have some version of a flood story. And when I first found out about that, my reaction was, and mind you, this is coming from someone with no training in anthropology or anything, but hey, maybe it's like everybody followed the same line of reasoning where, hey, it rains and then there's a puddle. So then you see a sea or an ocean, you're like, hey, a giant puddle, there must have been a giant rain at some point. Maybe that's what happened, who knows. But to bring this back to the vampire thing, it's not really immediately clear in the absence of fairly advanced science why a body would swell up after death or make it look like they've been feeding, or why the sickness that killed the person would spread after their death. And this is the part that'll freak you out a little bit if you're claustrophobic, just to give you a heads up. It's not always easy to be absolutely sure someone's dead. It certainly wasn't easy in Stoker's time and before Stoker's time. Burying live people by accident was a thing. People managing to find their way out of the ground was a thing. So the reality of vampire belief, that's something Farson goes fairly in depth on, and it's significant when you're reading Dracula that Stoker is building on and innovating upon a literary tradition and a folklore tradition in interesting ways. But he's also telling a story about something that a lot of people believed in a very literal sense, and which a lot of people were very, very afraid of. In Stoker's case, it was his mother who would have likely been the formative influence, rather. When it comes to the scarier side of things, and this is sort of the note that Farson actually opens the book with. So Stoker himself was born in Dublin in 1857, but his mother lived in Western Ireland during the cholera epidemic of the 1830s and is known to have had very gruesome stories to tell her son. According to Farson, included some stories about people who've been buried alive. So yeah, like I said, it's an older biography. It's a slightly shorter one, a little bit brisker of a read, but a lot of fascinating stuff in there. I actually read it back in summer 2017 when I was teaching a class where we talked a lot about Dracula. It's one of those classes that meets for like 3 hours a day, 4 days a week, and we spent 4 or 5 of those classes talking about Dracula or something related to Dracula. So we got pretty deeply immersed. I kind of worked excerpts of a lot of different film adaptations in there, but the only one we watched in its entirety was the 1920 version of Nosferatu, the original one. And here's the mistake I think I made with that. So Nosferatu is frequently ranked, still after all these years, after about a century now, as one of the 5 or 10 greatest horror movies of all time. So it obviously had some staying power, right? But the one thing that didn't age as well, maybe, is the musical score. Because, it's a silent film, but silent films, they have, like, silent film just means they don't talk. They're done to music, so. But yeah, the very, very intense organ music in the original version of the film, that's probably for a lot of contemporary audiences. I know, at least for me, it's kind of a bit much. First time I saw the movie was actually back when I lived in Eugene, Oregon. There's a theater a few blocks from where I was living. It's called the Bijou. It's actually a converted morgue, and they do a lot of great stuff there, a lot of shows, a lot of indie films. But for Halloween one year, they were showing Nosferatu, but with a live orchestra playing an original score for it. And it was really, really great. It was an amazing experience, and the score, of course, was great. And I've seen it a couple times with something like that, with like a string orchestra doing the music rather than the original organ score. And yeah, I think it's better that way. I think that's definitely the way I recommend watching it. All right, with that, thank you for tuning in. I hope everybody has a nice night.